Welcome back to Oregon Public Retirement. I'm your host, Daniel Ryan, certified financial planner and IRS enrolled agent, as well as author of the book, Oregon Public Retirement. This is the financial planning playbook for Oregon public servants. In today's topic and conversation, we're going to be talking about the working and retirement rules as a PERS retiree so that you can understand what the limitations may be, if any, if you go back to work for another PERS employer, or if you choose to work in the private sector and so forth as you continue into your first retirement. Now, this is going to be for Tier 1, Tier 2, and OPSERT members, whether you're in police and fire or general service. So if you fall into any of those categories, you're in the right place. Without further ado, let's get into it. Now, like I said, today we're focusing on the working and retirement rules. This would be if you are going to be a retiree under PERS, meaning collecting the PERS pension, and you're curious what you are allowed to do in the actual coming months or years as a retiree going back to work for a PERS employer or a private employer for that matter. A lot of public educators and firefighters and so forth, they retire really young. And so the reason that we're even having this conversation is because you don't want to be bored in retirement, or you might be looking to, quote, turbocharge your retirement plan. And this allows you to do that. So while we start to unpack this, that's essentially the premise. Some people have heard of what's called double dipping or working the bubble. These are terms that are also attached to the working in retirement rules, but they actually play a different purpose, and they're typically union sponsored and protected if you have a union as well. So I'm going to break all of this down for you. Now, the first thing that we're discussing is the limitations on hours for those of you who are retiring and going to be collecting the PERS pension, but also still working for a PERS employer. I'm going to use the example of a school district because this is really where the idea of working the bubble actually came from in that phrase. Now, it used to be before the year 2020 that people who were PERS members could not work past what they called the 1040 rule. That is 1,039 hours that you could work for a PERS employer without becoming an active PERS member again. Because you're collecting your retirement, your employer was not having to pay into the system, neither were you. And so thus PERS is going to say, well, you can't do that too much because if you're working full time, we're going to assume you're not actually retired. And so thus the birth of the 1040 rule came about. Now, that used to be the case for 2020 and before, since the pension was created. And there's new rules, but I'll explain that in a second. Now, school teachers in particular, they caught on to this and they said, well, the 1040 rule is applicable to a calendar year, not a school year. And so if you were going to retire July 1st as an educator and then come back to work full time from basically the last week of August through December, you would have not hit 1040 or 1,039 hours to be exact. And thus you would still be collecting the pension and making money on top of it, which feels pretty great. Then you would go from January to the end of June and still not be able to hit the 1040 rule limitations because you were only going to work the 6 months. This is why they call it working the bubble, is because there's this little bubble in time on the back half of a year and the front half of the next year where you could have been collecting your pension and also getting paid your full salary on top of that. And that feels pretty great. That's why I call that one the turbocharged retirement plan. Now, your employer always has to agree with this, and this is still an active strategy that we use for clients because it's usually union sponsored and protected for my client. And that means that they're not going to be disassociated with the union so that if something happened that they would have issues. Some school districts, for example, still pay the health care all the way through. Some don't. Some of them change the way that you're paid based on hours and some don't. So you have to really talk to your employer specifically before you just go into this strategy head first. Okay. Now, this all changed a bit in the year 2020. Technically in 2019, that is when Senate Bill 1049 was passed. Then just a couple of years later, the House Bill 2296 was passed, and that effectively changed all of these limitations for those of you who are in what they call normal retirement age. So I know that that can be a little confusing. There's a lot of vernacular here and lingo and technical terms, but essentially what PERS was saying is as a tier 1 member, if you're over the age of 58 or you have 30 years of service, then you could actually work as many hours as you want now. And the reason they're doing this is because while they were concerned about people coming back to work and taking basically jobs from the next generation, now the next generation isn't quite fulfilling all the job needs. And so a lot of PERS employers are asking retirees to please come back. We don't have enough people. And so they're actually collecting their pension and their salary on top of that. So they're effectively getting at least a 50% increase on what they were making. That is the premise. And that's why PERS agreed to do this, where they said, okay, now going forward until the end of the year 2034, they've extended this for this 15-year period of time. They are telling PERS members, you can work as much as you want for any PERS employer, and please help us fulfill all the job positions. And so that's basically the incentive, is that you can become a PERS retiree, collect the pension, and then go back to work as many hours as you would like for the school district, fire department, whatever it is that you were already going to be doing anyways. So this can really help people, and especially those of you who are trying to save as much for retirement in your 403b or 457 as you possibly can, and you maybe feel like you're behind. And what this does is it gives you maybe a smaller pension than if you were going to keep working for the next 15 years or 5 years or 1 year, but it's only a slight difference in most cases. Versus getting that whole pension on top of your normal income, well, that could increase your 403b and 457 by $20,000 to $50,000 per year, depending on the circumstances. People really like that, and that's why I call it the turbocharged retirement. That's because if you needed to get an extra boost, kind of double your income, or maybe get a 50% increase on your income, then we can shelter all that in a 403b or a 457 by keeping it tax deferred, and get all that money into a tax-deferred investment account and then take it out when you're ready upon your actual complete retirement, so that we know that we're not getting killed in taxes. Because what happens is if you actually retire and collect a pension and your full income, then that can certainly triple or double your income, whatever you're used to making with your spouse and so on. If you're both doing this at the same time, this can be a lot of extra taxes that didn't have to be there. You're probably not going to use that money. You wanted to save for retirement, for when you're actually going to be done working. That's why we usually pair this all together and we say, hey, you should contribute to 457 or a 403b. If you're a school teacher, you could do both, by the way, and that will allow you to shelter a lot of that income in a tax deferral status, so that when you're in retirement, you can pull that out back when you're in the 12% bracket instead of the 30% tax bracket. So really critical that we take a look at what your overall plan is, but that's effectively why it is called double dipping or working the bubble. Now, your question might be, well, Daniel, I am not quite to my normal retirement age as a tier 1 person, which is age 58 or 30 years of service, which could be a 52-year-old who has 30 years of service. If you're tier 2, your normal retirement age is 60 if you have fewer than 30 years of service. But certainly if you have 30 years, you can still be age 52, for example, and be, quote, normal retirement age. Or if you're OBSERP members, 65 is your actual normal retirement age if you have fewer than 30 years in the Oregon Public Service Retirement Plan. Or it's age 58 with 30 years. So let me give you a couple of examples. Let's say that Joe was working in Washington, and Joe was hired into the Oregon PERS pension system in 1990. And so Joe is thinking, hey, I'm tier 1, but I started late in the Oregon public sector because I was working the first 10 years over in Washington. And so now I'm 55 and I only have 20 years of service. I can technically start accessing the pension at 55, but I won't be my normal retirement age because I don't have 30 years in the Oregon Tier 1 pension system. And so Joe in this example would still be limited to the 1040 rule and can only get the PERS pension, which would be reduced, by the way, because he's not normal retirement age. And he can only work up to the 1,039 hours before PERS says you are working full-time. You're not a PERS retiree, you're an active member, and they will take away the pension and put you back into active status, which would be a big bummer. Now let's use another example. Let's say Susan was working in CalSTRS in California, and they were a tier 2 person. They were hired in the year 2000. And so they have the same problem. They were hired in the year 2000. They only had 10 years in CalSTRS, and they have 20 years now at Oregon PERS. If they're 59, not 60, but 59, they are not normal retirement age yet because they only have 20 years in the Oregon PERS system, even though they've been teaching for 30 years. Not in Oregon, though. And the same issue could be created if you were in the OPSERP pension. Let's say that you were not in any other pension. You just came in late because you wanted to be in the Oregon public sector. And maybe you were a private school teacher. And then you've lived in Oregon your whole life, but you taught private school for 20 years. And now you started in the Oregon public sector as a public school teacher at age 50. And you get to age 60 and you've got 10 years and you're thinking, I would love to do this strategy. Well, you would technically be able to get to the pension, but it would be reduced because you're not your normal retirement age, which is 65 for an OPSERP member. Maybe you got hired in the year 2010 in this example. And so you don't have enough years in the public sector in Oregon to qualify under normal retirement age rules. PERS will put back on these limitations and say for tier 1 and tier 2 people, if you don't have 30 years, you need to be 58 or more if you're tier 1 or 60 if you're tier 2. And if you're OPSERP, you have to be over 65 if you don't have 30 years. And that is why it's critical to know these normal retirement age rules. But getting to 30 years pretty much fixes that for most everybody. Now, for OPSERP people, it's a little bit different. It's not called the 1040 rule for you guys. You can only work up to 599.99 hours before they put you back into active status, which is even shorter duration. You can only work like 1 day every other week. That's basically what they're saying is you cannot work very much. This has to be really, really haphazard and sporadic if you're going to do that. Now, there's another exception that PERS created, and that is if you give a 6-month waiting time, then all the rules are off and you can come back. What that would look like is Joe, who's tier 1, came in late, and they're 55. They say, I only have 20 years in the Oregon public sector, but I'm really not getting a thrill from my current role. I'm going to take 6 months off. I'm going to start collecting my reduced pension because I feel like I need to do that. And I'm going to come back to a different employer or the same employer. 6 months later, you get that income again in 6 months, and you can start collecting your pension on top of it, albeit a reduced pension. But you will have access to that with unlimited hours. So effectively, Joe could come back at 56 and then work until 65 and would have been collecting both the pension and their full salary from those 9 different years of working after the pension started. Now, if you are going to work in retirement, this double dip or work the bubble strategy is usually written into school contracts, and they basically let you work the whole school year. Depends on if you're administrator, certified, classified, all these different contracts exist. And so you got to really make sure you understand your specific circumstance. But what happens is you can do the whole school year, but usually not any more than that. Effectively, what the school district is saying is you can do that 1 school year, but then if you want to keep working for us, PERS will let you do that, and we will let you do it, but not in the same position or status. You probably won't be covered by the union, and you would probably be hired in a different role. So maybe you don't get that same classroom. If you're a 5th grade teacher, you might not be able to teach 5th grade with the same class, same school, and all that other stuff. So you might be rehired as a retiree is the language that we would use there, and they will just find a different position entirely for you. So that's certainly possible. Sometimes, if you're especially in CTE, for example, they will actually rehire you, and they will say, please come back. There are not that many people who can do the CTE positions. And so thus we would love to have you full-time back in your exact position. That's fine. This is certainly possible. PERS doesn't care from their perspective anymore until the end of the year 2034. And the PERS employer is really the one who's going to put that hammer down and say, you know what, we only did it for 1 year and we just didn't want to, keep going from there. We want to hire a younger person. Maybe we do have enough people coming into the jobs that we would like to pay them half the salary that you're used to making at the end of your career. So that could all be very, very possible. Now, if you were going to go work for anyone else outside of the Oregon PERS employers, that has always been okay. You can always work an unlimited amount. from PERS's perspective. So let's say that you retired under Oregon PERS and then you go work for a big company like Nike and Beaverton or something like that. You can work as much as you'd like to. Now, I like to poke fun and say, now that just means you're bad at retirement, right? You got to go enjoy life too, right? But that's completely fine. You can go work in the private sector, start your own company, whatever, makes you happy and fulfilled in life. And those are all examples where you have no limitations from PERS's perspective to keep working as much as you want to. There is one caveat that I like to point out in coordination with Social Security. Social Security has a different rule for those of you who are collecting Social Security before what they call is your full retirement age. For most people, if you were born after the year 1960, your full retirement age is age 67. And that would be most people coming up into this upcoming time frame. If you were born in between 1954 and 1960, it's probably 66 and a half or 66 and 10 months, depends on what year you were actually born in that specific example. But for most of you, 67 is going to be the example we use. What we are saying is, if you're going to take Social Security at 62, and you want to collect your PERS pension, that's fine. But if you're also working and making more than $22,340 in that year, and it is divided by 12 months, by the way, then Social Security will say, hey, we thought you were retired. Well, if you're not, then we're going to have some of that money brought back in. And if you make way too much, we want it all back. Okay, so if you're going to get $1,500 per month, and then Social Security finds out, hey, you made $32,000 last year, then we're going to ask for $10,000 back or $5,000 back, whatever amount that you're working past their threshold. They're going to start to have their own problems. For them, it's a dollar amount, not an hours limit. And for Social Security, it's any work, because Social Security is paid by almost every employer. There's a few exceptions, public entities in California and the city of Portland and so forth, but they're very, very rare. So most of the time, Social Security will say, you are working too much, you are making too much, really. And so we're going to take those benefits back and then start the process over again whenever you stop doing this. And so that is why you want to be aware of the Social Security rules in addition to the PERS ones, because they just function differently. Now, this is how everything works in the working the bubble strategy. It's also called double dipping. And then once you do that first full year, then you become rehired as a retiree if you're going to go into a PERS employer and say, I'm collecting my PERS pension, but I would love to work here as well. And this is how working and retirement rules work in Oregon Public Service here in the great state of Oregon. So until next time, happy planning.